Welcome to True Crime Garage. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, thanks for listening. I'm your host, Nick, and with me, as always, is a man who hosts weekly riots in his garage. Here is the captain.
I like to call them quiet riots. It's good to be seen and good to see you. Thanks for listening. Thanks for telling a friend.
Today, we are still very much enjoying a brew called Dark Lord from Floyds Brewing. This Russian-style imperial stout is brewed with coffee, Mexican vanilla, and Indian sugar. This beer is only available one day out of each year. That is in April and at the brewery only. We have some, thanks to our friends Janelle and West, so cheers to them, and let's cheers some of our other garage friends as well. Next up, we have Sassy and Danny Boy from Waverly Hall, Georgia.
And a big We Like Your Jib goes out to Robin from New Mexico.
We also have a double-fisted cheers to Barbara and Dale Hemptonstall from Drumheller, Alberta, Canada. And last but certainly not least, we have Sean and Shannon from Port Angeles, Washington. Everyone we just mentioned, they went to truecrimegarage.com, clicked on the pint glass, helped us out with this week's beer fund for the beer run, and for that, we thank you.
Yeah, BWRUN Beer Run, adding new content every day to our YouTube channel. So make sure you subscribe to True Crime Garage TV on the YouTubes. And Colonel, that's enough of the business.
All right, everybody, gather around, grab a chair, grab a beer. Let's talk some true crime. On the rainy night of October 13th, 1968, Clyda, who was 8 months pregnant, and her 3 sons spent the evening at Don Delaney's apartment watching a televised Disney movie. According to Don Delaney, he took them home after the movie and dropped them off at Nancy Warren's property at 8:45 p.m. We're going to get into some of the details of this case, what details we have. But I want to put something forth here where this statement says 8:45 p.m. I've seen other reports that would put this drop-off time as late as 9:30 p.m. and it seems like most of the reports are stating 9:30 p.m. rather than 8:45 p.m. A difference of just 45 minutes, but that could be paramount to this case. We talked a little bit about the time of death and not being able to narrow that down to any great degree on part 1 of this case. But it's key because there were major questions about this case from the start. And this drop-off time is really where my major questions about this case start. And the devil is in the details, Captain, and he certainly has been hiding here for a very long time. According to the statement, Don Delaney, after dropping them off, let's say 9:30 p.m., he then headed to Sacramento. This is because, remember, he's a California Highway Patrol officer. He is in the process of undergoing specialized training. And from my understanding, this was a training course that lasted 2 weeks where he has the weekend off. So he hangs out with his wife, or at least the woman who has his last name, who he has fathered the unborn child with, and her 3 kids at his apartment with his daughter up until dropping them off that night and then having to leave to travel to Sacramento so he can stay the night that night to be there, waking up there the next morning to start what I understand is the second week of his training, which would take place Monday through Friday. Now, we should point out here that this would be approximately a 2-hour and 30-minute drive from where they are located, which is about 5 or 6 miles, maybe south of Ukiah, California. And he's headed to Sacramento.
So in any murder investigation, the timeline is going to be crucial, but also the evidence that we can find at the crime scene. But because part of the crime scene is outside, the weather is going to become a factor here.
Yeah, the weather is a big time factor, right? So you would expect, and I'm always shocked. You know, we talked about this in the Nancy Eagleson case, where there was no reports of any type of shoe prints, boot prints, tire tracks. We know that in that case that she was abducted, placed into a vehicle, drove down the road about 6 miles away, just 6 miles away, and pulled over to the side of the road where she's killed and dumped in the woods, like right at the tree line. I've been to that scene. You would have had to have parked your vehicle in the dirt and or mud, regardless if you killed her in the vehicle and then dragged her out to where she was found or killed her where she was found. You should have some boot and shoe prints. There's no mention of that in that case. Here in this case, we know that that was their hopes. They had hoped that they were going to find tire tracks, boot and shoe prints to potentially find and lead them, give them a good lead to a suspect. But because of this rain, and it's described as a heavy rain, the police openly talked about that in the early stages in this investigation in the newspaper, saying we were hoping to get tire tracks, but due to the weather conditions of that night and early morning, that simply was not possible. Now, sometime between the waning hours of Sunday night and the dawning of Monday morning, Clyda Jean and Nancy Warren were attacked and killed. Both women were viciously beaten and strangled. Now, we talked about in part one that Clyda was likely only struck once. So the statement, the report we have here, Captain, states Clyda was struck in the face a single time. There's no description if they believe that this was with an item or just with one powerful fist. But then she was strangled with this leather bootlace, or as some newspapers were calling it, a thong. Unfortunately, she dies from this strangulation. Her baby, she's 8 months pregnant at the time, perished in the womb, and her lifeless body was left on the ground, found between her trailer and her grandmother's home. Nancy, inside of her home, Nancy Warren, in her trailer nearby, was attacked in her trailer, suffering multiple contusions of the face and head, fractured right ribs, and hemorrhages of the spleen. So her attack seems much longer, many more blows, much more severe than what we see against Clyda. Now, like her granddaughter Clyda, she was strangled with this leather cord and ultimately died of ligature strangulation. She's discovered lying in a puddle of blood on her living room rug. As we mentioned, the leather cord that was found tightly looped around both of the victims' necks. So we have two leather cords, both approximately 36 inches in length. When the Mendocino County Sheriff's Office and their deputies arrive on the scene, they find the two women fully dressed, killed in that identical manner of the strangulation with the leather cord. No sexual assault occurred on either woman. That seems to be a pretty definitive statement. Really, we have no witnesses here, with the exception, we should note that we have a dachshund, a little dog that belonged to Nancy Warren, who was found almost next to her when the deputies arrive on the scene. They ruled out, remember we talked about them initially ruling out robbery as a possible motive, and I want to make sure we circle back to that before we wrap up here today, because I think that was one of a few missteps in what was a very complicated and convoluted crime scene.
But sometimes when you're law enforcement, you just don't have anything to go off of. We don't know who the targeted victim is. We don't know if it's one attacker or multiple attackers. We don't have a definitive timeline. It's kind of vague and large. That's what she said. And then at the crime scene, we have really lack of evidence other than the blood evidence that you talked about.
We have one statement, and I really wanted to find a way to see if we could back this up with anybody else's statements, and there just was no way. But one of Nancy Warren's daughters would claim that she had attempted to call her mother at 10:15 p.m. that night. Remember, we have Don Delaney saying he drops off Clyda and the kids at approximately 9:30. Nancy Warren's daughter says that her call at 10:15 that night went unanswered. If in fact she did call that night at 10:15, the phone's not answered, that means either Nancy Warren ignored the call, was busy and missed the call, or was being attacked or already killed when the call came in. The crime scene, here's where they were able to do some real good work. And I bet you they thought that this was going to lead to the killer. Or when you have a situation where you do have a suspect pool, which we will see that here in a bit, you're hoping that this evidence will separate your best suspect from the not so good ones.
Right.
But what they did find was the crime scene investigation revealed fingerprints in Nancy Warren's trailer that did not belong to family members or to the first responders. We also know that type O blood was found under her fingernails. She had type A blood. A few days later, it was revealed or believed by the family and presented to law enforcement that an antique jewelry box that could have contained, the information here states, could have contained anywhere from $300 all the way up to $5,000 worth of jewelry and merchandise, was missing from Nancy Warren's trailer.
Robbery could be a motive, but like you said, they said it wasn't.
And the purse is dumped in Clyda's trailer. When you have a situation where you go, we can't figure out the motive, just because you found a cash box with $300 in it that was in plain sight, maybe the killer missed that. Maybe robbery was the intent here. And maybe it wasn't a situation where we're going to threaten this woman and try to get money from her. Could it have been somebody that knew her, that killed her and then decided they're going to take what they want, but may have had to get out of there faster than they wanted to?
Or is it just a situation where we're committing this crime, and while we're here, might as well grab a couple items of value?
Mm-hmm.
That's what gets so tricky with some of these cases, especially when there's little items, or like you said, this box. The box doesn't have to be that big to carry a lot of valuables in it. And so then you just go, well, okay, so we murdered her and let's grab this box.
Mm-hmm.
Or is it, let's grab this box because maybe it'll throw law enforcement off the trail?
Now, one detail here that I think is very key, because Don Delaney, he was interviewed the following day.
Yeah.
And he's got a great alibi, right? He's in Sacramento for law enforcement training, a refresher course.
He's either in Sacramento or he's on his way to Sacramento. Yes.
The records have him as being at that law enforcement training facility in Sacramento. He, according to the sheriff's report, seemed genuinely upset by the triple murder. And we do have the reverse, the flip of that, Captain, is family members of Nancy Warren saying that they doubted his sincerity. He, upon being questioned, and he's being questioned, he's being talked to, and he is at the property with the sheriff's office when he's giving some of these statements. So during that portion of giving the statements, he offers up a theory to police that maybe the women were attacked by hippies who had came to Nancy's door looking to borrow gas. And he says that he believes that there was a gas can that was missing from the property. And that's what he's basing this off of.
It's a weird story to surmise. That's your new favorite word, surmise.
It isn't so weird if there is, in fact, a missing gas can. But the problem that I have, and I think that the family has with this story, is Nancy Warren's family tells the investigating officers, look, our mother kept a 38 in a drawer, a silverware drawer, right next to the front door. If anybody knocked on the door, especially after dark, that gun was in her hand when she's opening up the door.
Well, and I guess it's just weird that he says hippies, because when I think hippies, and obviously I wasn't around during that time, but when I think hippies, I think peace and love, man.
Well, that was the idea, but
Right.
we know it didn't always work out that way. The other thing too is you get some of these drug fueled hippies. Sometimes you have peace and love people that woke up with peace and love in their hearts, and now they're doing and committing acts that they never would, but because they're fueled on drugs.
And they have to keep the habit alive, and they got to keep this nomadic lifestyle going.
But also keep in mind the great divide in the late 60s in this country would be between the clean-cut law enforcement officers and the long-haired hippies. Of course, clean-cut police officers are going to believe that hippies with no jobs that hitchhike rides and smoke dope all day are going to be up to no good.
Okay, yeah, I forgot.
He's law enforcement.
He's law enforcement.
He's a highway patrol officer. Think about how many hippies he's probably pulled over leading up to this situation. So maybe he's going into it with some prejudice, or maybe he's trying to cover his own ass in the situation.
Do we have any other murders at the time that would resemble this murder?
In this direct area, the problem was I was trying to look for homicides in this direct area leading up to this October 1968 date. The only reference I could find was they were referencing other double homicides, right? They were probably looking for something that was very similar. And I don't think that gives us a great indication of if there could be another murder at some previous time that could be connected to this. Because as I pointed out in part one, there's a large part of me that believes that murder number 2 only happened because murder number 1 happened.
Right.
And like with any situation, if somebody sets out to do something, your crime scene can get very wonky real quickly if it doesn't go down the way that he or she anticipated. And if he or she or a group of people had to kill victim number 2 because of victim number 1, well, then that really mucks up your whole motive, because their motive was never to kill 2 people. Their motive would have been to kill 1.
Right.
To me, I really believe that with this case, and we've talked about how important motive is so much in these murder cases, that, you know, I get it that a prosecutor doesn't really have to prove motive at a homicide murder trial, but for an investigator, motive is very powerful stuff to finding out who did it and why they did it. But the thing that I want to hone in on here and circle around and around and around. We have statements from the sheriff's office that say when they were told this statement of, well, mom keeps a 38 in her silverware drawer right next to the front door, and if anybody knocks on the door, that gun's coming out of that drawer. That tells me something very important about our victim here. Nancy Warren locks her front door. Why is that important to this case? Her killer obviously was in the trailer with her. So she wasn't just sitting there watching the nightly news and some guy busts in through her front door, comes walking in through the front door and attacks her and kills her. That's not what happened here. You don't keep a 38 in a drawer next to your front door and not lock your front door. Either somebody tricked her into allowing them into her trailer, or it was somebody that she knew and she put that gun back in the drawer. Because when her family gives that statement to the sheriff's deputies at the scene of the murder, they open up the drawer and that gun's still in there.
No, I agree with you, and I'm going to point something out, and I hope you don't get mad at me. The problem, though, too, is we have these 2 trailers that are very close together. What was the dynamic? What was the protocol that would happen when one individual would go visit the other individual's trailer? So is it possible that both of the victims started out in the same location?
Yeah, I wanted to get a better description of of Clyda's body and how it was lying between those two trailers? Was there anything there to suggest that she was fleeing Nancy's trailer? Was there anything to suggest that she was running toward Nancy's trailer? That, unfortunately, we do not have a description that would provide us with any way to speculate on that detail of this case.
This is also information that the kids might not have known. So even if they question the kids, they might not know. When visiting the other trailer, when they step in the door, do they lock the door immediately at night, or do they just leave it open? Does the person that's, every time the person leaves their trailer, do they lock it behind them when the kids are there or not there? That's where it gets a little more complicated. But I do believe if they're in their trailers and it's dark out, it makes sense that they would lock the door, especially if they have a gun right next to the door.
Oh yeah. You don't have a loaded firearm next to your front door and be a person that doesn't lock the door. Now, over the course of 1,000 nights or 2,000 nights, could somebody forget to lock their door? Absolutely. But
Right.
We're not here to talk about ifs, ands, or buts. This is a game of poker. You play the averages, you play the numbers, and the numbers and the averages here would suggest that her door was locked that night. There's no sign of forced entry. She's brutally attacked and strangled and killed on her living room floor.
I'm here to talk about butts and thongs and Cisco.
We do have a neighbor that reported seeing a blue pickup truck sitting in an orchard. This would be near the antique shop. Again, the antique shop was not entered during the course of that night. It wasn't broken into. There was nothing missing from the antique shop. The police are on record saying multiple times nobody entered that antique shop. I have to take them for their word on that.
Okay, so the antique shop's not that far from the road, but the trailers are further back than the antique shop. See, that's what makes the most sense to me.
But very close in proximity.
Yeah, what makes the most sense to me is instead of pulling into the driveway, like you said, if it's raining or if it's muddy, it's not a paved driveway, just stay on the road, go in, commit the robbery, and chances are it's like if I'm at this antique shop and I know that the owner, just by talking to her, lives behind the shop, well, I'm just going to assume that she's not leaving the money in the shop, that she's probably taking the money home with her. So park on the road, run in there, maybe multiple people, take what you can, run out, and nobody's the wiser.
The thing is, I mean, if you're just looking for a snatch and grab to get valuables and potential money, you break into the antique store. And like you said, for somebody to believe that any valuables that would come out of that store would be in a location other than that, they would have to know the detail that the owner of the store lives next door, lives right by there. Again, it's suggesting some intimate knowledge of the victim.
Yeah, or like you said, this other box of jewelry, that would be intimate knowledge, whether or not the owner of the shop takes the money home, whether or not she takes a box of the most precious items home.
Regarding this blue pickup truck that was spotted by one of the neighbors, he recalls seeing 5 boys wearing hippie-type clothing in the vehicle, according to his statement. When asked why they were there by the witness, he said that they claimed that they simply pulled over to sleep or take a nap for the night. A second witness confirmed seeing the same pickup truck, but we don't get a description from this second witness as to how many people may have been in it or who was in the pickup truck, just that a similar truck was spotted by a second witness who says that they saw this pickup truck drive out of the orchard around 8:15 a.m. Now,
doesn't this eyewitness and this contact by the eyewitness, doesn't this make you wonder, was Delaney, the husband, let's say, quote unquote, the husband, was he privy to this information? Because if he was, then his story about hippies stopping by to get some gas would make a little more sense.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could easily explain it away if he truly believed that there was a gas can missing from the property, and he overhears that we now have 2 witnesses that spot the same style and color truck.
Right.
in the area. One of them saying that hippies were in the truck. He could just be putting two and two together and offering up a theory to police. The problem that I have with this second witness's statement is that they're saying that the pickup truck pulled out of the orchard around 8:15 a.m. Well, the bodies have been discovered by the 8-year-old boy prior to this time frame, and police would have either been en route or at least a deputy car on scene before 8:15 a.m. Now, all the more better reason to get out of Dodge, right? But what you're gonna kill these women? I don't think either of them went to bed that night. We find one woman in the living room and another woman, she's outside and her bed is still made from the day before. You killed both women and then you just hung around there and just stayed there for hours and hours and decided not to leave until the police showed up? That doesn't make any sense.
Doesn't make much sense. And the other thing that doesn't make a lot of sense to me is 5 individuals in a pickup truck.
Right. What I think we have here is I think that we have this is desperation shown on the behalf of the persons that live nearby. Who would have the reason to be most fearful in this situation? The neighbors, right? They're just trying to be helpful. They're trying to offer up any information. To me, I hate to be so dismissive of this information, but it seems to me like we just have people that are trying to help. They probably saw something, but I don't think that it's of any importance to finding the killer or killers of Clyda and Nancy Warren.
Well, on top of that, if these guys are the killers, why would they not just kill the eyewitness? They just killed 2 women, one that was pregnant. Why would they hesitate to kill this individual? All right, we are back. Peace and love. Cheers. Cheers to you, Colonel.
Cheers to you, Captain. Usually here I'm cheersing the people in the back and having a moment of cheerfulness and saying tall cans in the air. But I want to point out something that's very important to everybody right here, right now, because this is something that is taking place very soon. There is an incredibly important parole hearing date that is going to take place this month, July 24th. This is the South Carolina Board of Paroles and Pardons, and they are going to analyze and decide if Jeffrey Whitlock should be paroled. Now, Jeffrey Whitlock is responsible for the abduction, murder, and rape, and it was an incredibly brutal murder that took place in February of 1990. He was convicted, I believe, a year or two afterwards. The victim is Joanne Pruitt. We covered the case and went through some of the particulars of that case recently on Off the Record, but I am reaching out to everybody today and asking for your help to help encourage the South Carolina Board of Paroles and Pardons to not allow this individual to be paroled this month. You can go to change.org and simply search Jeffrey Whitlock. The petition will come up. Please sign this petition. The name is Jeffrey, Jeffrey. Whitlock is Whitlock. Look up his name and sign that petition. Let's not let this incredibly violent individual, evil individual, back out on the streets. And we will put that information in today's show notes as well. And if you haven't already, check out the Off the Record that we did on that case. We have some suspects, as we talked about here in this case, Captain. And, I can see by the hourglass that we need to move along. You and I have danced in some of the details or danced on some of the lack of details in this case. But again, it's from 1968. So it's a difficult case to report on and to bring you our coverage of. But we're hoping that even all these years later that our coverage will spread awareness about this case that seems to have been forgotten. And it's essentially a triple homicide case. Now, there were several theories, and let's go through theories. And these theories all involve some different suspects here. So one name that we've talked plenty about is Don Delaney. So theory number one, as I labeled it, the main suspect in the slayings of Clyda Delaney, her unborn baby and grandmother Nancy Warren, was California Highway Patrol Officer Don Delaney. Now, while he had an alibi, we talked about his reoccurring training course that he was taking in Sacramento. The circumstances of the couple's quickie marriage, their living situation at the time of the murders, that's all, to me, very highly suspect of this individual. So let's say they did get married in Reno. After their Reno wedding, Delaney continued to share an apartment with his teenage daughter, her name's Terry, and Clyda and her boys remained on her grandmother's property. In retrospect, his alibi seems shaky, very shaky, and I'll get into the details of that here in a bit. He says in his statement, because what we get all these years later, Captain, is people saying that, you know what, there's like 30 to 45 minutes missing from Don Delaney's timeline. So he checks in. We have this law enforcement facility, training facility that says we know he was here at 1:45 a.m. Now, they may be saying 1:45 a.m. at the latest, but their records indicate he was there at 1:45 a.m. His statement to the sheriff's office was that he dropped them off at 9:30, and then he head on down the road to get to this training facility. We already talked about earlier, it's a 2.5 hour drive. Look, I know that math is not the colonel's strong point here, but there seems to be more than 30 to 45 minutes missing from his story and his alibi. He claims that, my trip took longer than expected because at some point I realized that I had left my uniform at my apartment and I had to double back, retrieve the uniform, and then head to the training facility. So that's why the trip took longer than expected. I cannot say based off of his statement how far along he was into that 2.5 hour drive before he had to turn around and retrieve his uniform, if I am to believe that at all.
Right.
If he dropped them off at 9:30 and then immediately went on his way to the training facility, 2.5 hours, 10 o'clock, midnight. I have an hour and 45 minutes missing from this guy's timeline.
And I think he wouldn't look as shady, but to have a situation where you drop off your kids and then you're heading to this training spot and you just happen, the night that these murders took place, you just happen to not have your uniform and you have to turn around, causing your trip to be exponentially longer. But what's his blood type?
That's the problem. His blood type doesn't match the blood type that was found at the scene. I would like to know, were any of those fingerprints found in blood?
Right.
Because I don't think it would be out of the realm of possibility that Don Delaney did not kill Nancy Warren and his fingerprints were found in her trailer. Right. I mean, he had a long-term relationship with her granddaughter who lived yards away from her trailer. Right. So if you find those fingerprints in blood and they don't match his, then I'm thinking we have that Don Delaney and the killer are not one and the same.
Right.
The family, you do get these skewed. Here's the problem though. And we've seen this with cases that we've actually worked boots on the ground. You get these statements that sound so incriminating from family members of victims pointing to one suspect time and time again. But you have to keep in mind, they have a dog in the fight. Yeah. Right. They may believe that this person is guilty. And so when family members say, look, he seemed like he was pretending to be upset. He sounded like he was attempting to be upset. We think he really wasn't willing to cooperate in the investigation. That's all hearsay to me because of the emotion and the loss that these people have experienced. They're looking at it through a different lens than the rest of us would.
But we also see these statements change over time too, where maybe initially they didn't suspect him of the crime, then maybe his demeanor, his actions, and then they, again, like you said, they're seeing these actions through a different, like, anti-rose petal glasses.
Well, and I think you might have the same going on the flip of that, where you may have, it's 1968, you have Mendocino County Sheriff's Office investigating this case, and they are looking at this man who is a state highway patrolman, and maybe they're looking at it through a different lens going, well, we should take him at his word. He's a fellow officer. His statements should carry more weight than others. And, his blood type doesn't match the blood that's found at the scene. So there are some sources that say that the county sheriff's office cleared him as a suspect. I don't love reporting that because, one, I don't know how true that is. And two, I don't know that if they did in fact clear him, what did they base that off of? Just his word? The information that follows that statement is that he has an alibi. The alibi is this Sacramento training facility. Well, we've already covered that there's an hour and a half to an hour and 45 minutes missing from his timeline. That's not a great alibi, considering you can beat and strangle two women in less than an hour and a half's time.
Who are some of the other suspects in this case?
Well, you have the father. Remember, he was fighting for custody of his three boys.
Right.
Which ultimately it sounds like he was granted after the murder. So that makes me really want to look at him. There were rumors of, and I want to say rumors because I couldn't find any police reports to back this up, but there are rumors that the marriage ended due to domestic violence on his part. So the statements are that he was fiercely battling over custody rights of these three boys, and then mom ends up killed. She's seeing somebody else, already pregnant, maybe already even married. Again, though, with John, with the father, the statements are that he was eliminated from the suspect list as well, based off of verified statements of him being in Medford, Oregon at the time that the women were slain, which that's where he lived at the time. He has since passed away. He passed away in 2021. And from my understanding, Captain, while he might look good circumstantially, there was no evidence that ever tied him to the murders of his former wife and her grandmother. Probably the most intriguing, and this is one that maybe the listeners will find to be the most intriguing, is the Manson family, or at least a portion of the Manson family, has been considered and still sounds like still to this day might be a possibility in this case. And we know that the sheriff did not rule out this possibility. The way that they become suspects, the Manson family, or at least a portion of them, it's pretty loose, but it also cannot be ignored, in my opinion. So this is not just some bullshit where a nerd on his computer came up with this and posted this on some kind of message board or on somebody's blog decades later. No, the number one best-selling true crime book, Helter Skelter, page 619. Actually, don't quote me on that. It might be 617. It's either 617 or 619. Discusses the possibility of the Manson family having killed Clyda and Nancy Warren. So this is something that's been discussed for a long time. Now, if you go back and you look at the newspaper reports, in 1969, after the Tate and the LaBianco murders,
right,
we have the sheriff in this case, the Bedside murders, who is requesting information, evidence, crime scene photos after the Manson family is arrested in December of 1969. So this is well over a year. This is a year and a little more than a month or so after the Bedside murders. But due to similarities and due to the fact that he has record of a portion of the Manson family being in Ukiah, California, the summer before the Bedside murders took place. We know that is fact. That is absolute fact. Nobody can deny it. Charles Manson himself, we cannot prove was there, but several members of the Manson family, several members that were present and involved in either the Tate murders or the LaBianca murders were in Ukiah, California, because they were arrested after a drug party. In fact, they were labeled the witches of Mendocino County, which sounds fanciful, and it sounds like, oh, whoa, what were they up to? What kind of crimes did they commit? No, really, they just caught them at a drug party, and they caught them with drugs on their person. This would have been Quaaludes, marijuana, and LSD. So no record of committing violent crimes or even robberies in this area.
But later
they were at a party.
Did. Yeah, but later they committed violent crimes, and we have this eyewitness saying that, hey, I saw this truck with these hippies in it.
Well, and not just violent murders, but think about some of the similarities, right? Somebody went into Nancy Warren's house, into her dwelling, into her trailer, and killed her.
Yeah.
Well, in the Tate case, and there's multiple victims, but it's always referred to as the Sharon Tate case. In the Tate case, they went into that home and killed multiple victims. Okay, so Bedside murders, multiple victims, where the perpetrators entered the home. LaBianca, where Mr. and Mrs. LaBianca were killed. They went into their home and killed multiple victims. So there's some similarities. And let's not gloss over the fact that it takes a special kind of evil to kill a very pregnant woman. 8 months pregnant.
Yeah.
Was Clyda. Guess what? Sharon Tate was like 3 weeks away from her due date. So 2 women who were both very obviously pregnant were killed. And in the LaBianca murders, Manson was present for that one. We know for a fact he was present for that one. They tied up Mr. and Mrs. LaBianca, telling them, giving the old Dennis Rader, oh, we're just here to rob you. You know, Zodiac told some of his victims the same thing. I'm just here to take your car. I need your keys and some money. I just got to get out of here. They told the LaBiancas the same thing. And guess what they tied him up with? Leather cord. Very much like what was found at this same crime scene. And if you look up pictures, if you go to, you can go to CeloDrive.com and you can see all kinds of pictures from the LaBianca crime scene, and you can see photo archives of the evidence in that case. And you will see the leather cords, which are referred to as leather thongs, that were used to tie up the couple's hands before they were murdered in that case. Now, in both of those cases, they stole random items from the property. They didn't steal everything. These were successful people that have lived in big homes with lots of fancy things and lots of money.
Right.
They didn't steal everything, but they stole some things: watches, credit cards, stamps, driver's license, valuables. They stole things that were antiques.
And to me, that's not pointing to the motive of the murder. To me, that's what these individuals had to do on a daily basis, is they had to constantly be on the lookout for valuable items that they could stuff in their pocket so they can continue on with this nomadic party and drug-induced lifestyle.
Yeah, and so the sheriff, we know, looked into this and was pursuing this as a big lead in the case in 1969, so much so that it hit the newspapers and it stayed in the papers years after. Now, there is an interesting story. Johnny, the 8-year-old boy who found his mother and great-grandmother dead, that he told a reporter, this would have been less than 20 years ago. When he was being interviewed about this case all these years later, it was asked, do you think that the Manson family, Charles Manson and the Manson family, had anything to do with the murder of your mother? He said no. He said, my instincts tell me that they didn't have anything to do with it, even though the sheriff wouldn't deny the possibility even at that time, all those years and decades later. But he said, you might be interested in hearing this story, is that my father did time in prison. He did time in prison after the murders as well. And at one point, Charles Manson was locked up in Vacaville. Longtime listeners of the show will be familiar with that name because that's where Ed Kemper has been kept all these years. So in Vacaville, Manson was locked up there. And the story that Johnny's father told him was that one day he was walking with a group of guys and he saw Manson, who was sweeping the floors. He shouted to Manson hey, Charlie, who did that thing up in Ukiah? Now, his father told Johnny that there was no way for Charlie to know exactly who out of the group of guys yelled at him. But as his story goes, he says, Charlie Manson looked directly at me in the eye and said, quote, "You'll never know, will you?" Now, that's a very Charles Manson answer to a question he may have no idea what the guy was even talking about.
I mean, for a very small individual, he is a giant pile of shit.
Yes. There's not many that are bigger piles of shit, but it is certainly an interesting lead. I will say that the sheriff is on record as saying that both the Manson murders and the Bedside murders case both fall into the same category of they don't make any sense. I think that part of that is where this was lost, right? Unfortunately, I think that once there was no confession, once there was nobody that showed any obvious signs of guilt, and once the tire tracks, shoe prints, and boot prints were washed away from that heavy rain, that downpour, I think they were a little out of their league. I think that they may have run out of ideas. I got really tired investigating and researching this case and constantly hearing that the lack of motive was always a hindrance in this case. What do you mean lack of motive? There's every sign to me that there was robbery involved, that there were stolen goods from at least Nancy Warren's place. Her family saying that there could have been valuables up to maybe possibly $5,000. If you want to stage a scene, guess who would know to stage a scene, right? A guy that served time in prison would know that, you know what, if I'm going to go in here and knock off a person or two, it wouldn't be a bad idea to make it look like the motive was a robbery or to steal a bunch of stuff and just take it anyway. The other person that would know to stage a scene would be a state highway patrol officer. Make it look like a robbery, stage a scene, make it look like it was something that it wasn't. The problem I have here, and I hate that they moved off of, or at least by that one statement that I saw, is that they moved off of this Don Delaney. I think they took him at his word because of his law enforcement background. And it was 1968, right? You probably wouldn't move on from a state highway patrol officer so quickly in 2024. One thing that the Nancy Warren's family points out.
No, we have the Karen Reed trial.
One thing that Nancy Warren's family points out is Don Delaney says that he couldn't afford to buy a home big enough for the five of them. That's why they weren't living together. The Warren family says that Nancy Warren gave him $5,000 to use as a down payment on a house. She's dead, and all of a sudden he doesn't know anything about $5,000. Now, that is a he said, she said, or he said, they said situation.
Right.
But let's pretend for 30 seconds here that that's true. That the clock was ticking for this guy, my friend. Who stood the most to lose and the most to gain, and probably the most that he wanted to lose in this whole scenario? Don Delaney. The clock is ticking. The Warren family is expecting him to buy a home so that they could move out of the trailer. By the way, grandma is driving 3 times a day, 5 days a week to take these kids to school. They went to school in Hopland, California. So she's driving because they had different start times or finish times based off of their ages. She's driving these kids to school. That wears on a person. She's housing these people. At some point, if they got married, like she was told, aren't you telling that man, it's 1968, aren't you telling that man, be a man and get your wife and her kids and your soon to be child out of my property and start being a man here? The clock was ticking. She was due to give birth in November. They're killed in the middle of October. And who was harassing him about the $5,000? If he got it, did he spend it on something else? Maybe he wasn't lying when he said he couldn't afford to buy him a house. Maybe they weren't lying when they said they gave him $5,000. Maybe he just spent it on something else. He also would know that Nancy Warren's got valuable property inside of her home. He also would know, you know what? It's not a bad idea to go into this trailer and dump out this purse real quick. Oh, I got to kill Clyda because she spotted me coming out of the trailer, or may have looked in the window and saw me in the trailer killing her grandmother and could easily identify me. The other thing, too, that I wonder about here, Captain, does Nancy Warren, whether she likes Don Delaney or not, does she open up the door for him willingly on that night, no gun in hand, because they have to have a talk about the $5,000?
Or they just have to have a talk about their relationship.
Yeah. Do we have to have a talk about the situation of everything? Or is there a ruse of, hey, I'm here to talk about the money with you, paying it back to you or what have you? It's just, I have a real hard time. And I get that he was doing what seemed to be routine, because in his defense, there are several persons that say, you know what, it was not irregular for him to be dropping them off on a Sunday night, that they would often have Sunday dinner together, whether it be at the Warren's place or at his place or at a restaurant or what have you, and that he would be dropping Clyda and the kids off on Sunday nights. So that's not out of routine. But what it does is it puts him at the murder scene, and he also has a missing over 1 hour time frame from his alibied time frame.
I'm picking up what you're putting down. My only issue, though, is one of these things doesn't belong here, right?
The blood evidence is difficult.
The blood evidence is difficult. The fingerprints evidence is difficult. And the other thing, too, is we have, if this eyewitness is correct and they saw individuals that shouldn't have been there. See, by dropping off the kids, Delaney should be there. That makes sense why he would be there.
Yep.
But you have these other individuals that are spotted. Why are they there? They're not supposed to be there.
Yep.
And that's the thing I can't wrap my head around.
Well, and that probably mucked it up for the sheriff's office back in 68, right? Look, the sheriff's office is not going to be fond of hippies in 68. And guess what they're not going to be fond of in 69 after a group of, air quotes, hippies go out and murder 2 families.
And do you think because of the Manson connections, do you think that's why law enforcement maybe hasn't had the pressure on them to release more information about this case?
No, I think that it was 1968 and a lack of investigative resources did not provide them with physical evidence to give us certain details about the case. Right? I think that they were limited by technology and investigative know-how, not just by their outfit, but by the time. And that I think that this, obviously, I think we all can agree that this would have been investigated very differently and much more evidence would have been collected and stored if this took place 2 weeks ago. One part that I can't fault them for saying that Don Delaney's blood type doesn't match the blood type of who we think is the killer. The other thing that's not great for law enforcement when you get a typo blood type of your suspect is that that's the largest population, the largest portion of the population has typo blood. So that doesn't, if you're really hoping to narrow it down, that doesn't help a whole lot. But I think that I question the technology of 1968. We know that our victim bled a good amount at the crime scene. We know that our suspect, at least one of the suspects, bled at the crime scene. Do we have a mixing of that blood that would leave us with tainted blood evidence, that would leave us with tests that are not accurate? That's my strong suspicion here in this case, is that the evidence is probably just not so great. And a lot of that is due to it being 1968. Now, as to what you were saying, yes, that's something that has to be explored and considered, because there's no doubt that the masses believe, and there's 100% evidence. In fact, I believe they were even convicted of this, or some of them were convicted of it. There's other murders that the Manson family committed outside of the Tate murder scene and the LaBianca murder scene.
Right.
There absolutely is. At least two that I can think of. And then keep in mind, it was like 6 months. I'd have to go and check the exact dates, but I think it was like 6 months between the time that those murders took place that made them so infamous, between that time and the time that they were actually picked up and arrested for it. So what murders did they commit in the meantime?
Yeah, that's one of the things that's fascinating when you look into just the Manson family murders, is you have known criminal activity, known murders, and then there's a pretty big list of other murders that they're suspected of, and they just haven't been able to. I don't know if it's they couldn't get the confessions or they couldn't get the evidence to try them in court. Or is it one of those things like with the Atlanta child murders where there's just so many victims and you go, well, we got them on these murders and they're going to, most of the Manson family murderers are going to spend the rest of their life in jail. So close the books on these other cases.
Yeah. And here, so to give a little bit better information here, clean up of some of what I've said. So the murders that the Manson family is infamous for took place in early August. They were not arrested until December. You do have a good period of time that goes by. A gentleman by the last name of Crow was killed by the Manson family, and Gary Allen Hinman was killed by the Manson family as well. And then you have the Shea murder that took place. And then you have their suspects. They're considered to be suspects in, it's like 9 or 10 other murder cases. Now, some of that may be just simply you're trying to make connections where there is no connection. But like the sheriff said, in this case, he's not ruled out that possibility. It doesn't seem like a strong possibility. I sit here and I look at this case and I think there's better suspects, one in particular, that should be focused in on more than the Manson family.
You could be anywhere in the world, but you're choosing to be with us. It'd be nasty. Talk a little true crime. Colonel, do we have any recommended reading for the beautiful listeners?
Yes, we want to remind everybody to help us out with change.org to deny parole for convicted murderer Jeffrey Whitlock. We'll have that link in the show notes. And remember, we talked about that on Off the Record last week. So if you're a subscriber, check that out. If you're not a subscriber, subscribe and check it out and learn about that case and why we should be blocking parole of Jeffrey Whitlock. This week, Captain, let's recommend to the great listeners a book called Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s. This is by Tom O'Neill. For 20 years, Tom O'Neill had a fascination with the Manson murders, and his interviews and his investigation leads to shocking new revelations about the FBI, about the CIA, and, as said in the title, the secret history of the 60s. Check out the book Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s by Tom O'Neill. You can find that recommendation and many more on our website, truecrimegarage.com.
And until next week,
be good, be kind, and don't litter.